You see the title. Is this video about storytelling, or is it about rhetoric? Or is it linguistics? Which one is it? You may be surprised to learn that to Shakespeare, this would have been a silly question, and we'll get into that. But first, to be or not to be? That is the question. Actually, the question is, why is everyone still so familiar with this line 400 years after Shakespeare wrote it? Why, just this month, is Taylor Swift releasing music about Ophelia from Hamlet? What makes Shakespeare so memorable? My name is Corey Queen. I'm an attorney in Seattle, Washington, and before law school, I was a campus minister at the University of Tennessee. And as a lawyer, speaker, debater, my job is telling stories persuasively, and the single most important book that I have read for that purpose is The Complete Works of Shakespeare. He offers a masterclass bar none. Today, we're breaking down why he was so effective and what we can learn from it. But if you do nothing else, simply read his work. If excellence is the pinnacle of the mountain, you will get much closer to the top if you let world-defining geniuses like Shakespeare be your guide. Go it alone and you'll make some progress, but not nearly as much. But I'm not here to simply point you to Shakespeare. There's plenty that we can learn from him even here today. And one simple way that you can learn from Shakespeare is to learn what he learned in grammar school. Shakespeare scholars widely assume that he attended grammar school because his writing displays a strong foundation in grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which he would have gotten in grammar school. And here's a key point that I alluded to a moment ago that many moderns will not find intuitive. Logic, grammar, rhetoric, storytelling, we tend to view these nowadays as totally distinct domains. The novelist doesn't need to know anything about formal logic. That's for the philosophers. The debater isn't expected to be well versed in poetry, much less compose it himself. That's the modern view. But in Shakespeare's day, this stark distinction did not exist. Great poetry was expected to be logical, sound logic was conveyed rhetorically, and great rhetoric was poetic. In fact, Elizabethan dramatists, storytellers, tended to view their stories as playgrounds for logic and rhetoric. Their characters held ideas that people really can hold and fought for those ideas with philosophical and rhetorical rigor. As Stanford literature professor Hardin Craig observed, Elizabethan literature is alive with debate. It is no wonder that drama flourished, which is itself an art of contest, dialogue and debate, agreement and disagreement. So, what exactly did they teach Shakespeare in grammar school? If you want a meticulously researched discussion of that education, read Shakespeare's use of the arts of language by Sister Miriam Joseph. This book is masterful in its own right, and I've put a link for it in the description. Here today, I'll just briefly note two key schools of thought on rhetoric from Aristotle and Cicero that would have been the prevailing ideas in Shakespeare's day and which remain influential today. And there's a reason I'm doing this. Just outlining these schools of thought gives us a hint at the high quality thinking that underlies everything that Shakespeare wrote. So rhetoric, keep in mind, is simply the art of persuasion. And Aristotle's formula for rhetoric is broken into three well-known modes of persuasion and one lesser known. The first is logos, that's logic, rational argumentation. The second is pathos, emotion, dealing more with the sympathies and emotions of the audience. The third mode is ethos, an appeal to authority and establishing the credibility of the speaker to address the topic at hand. And the fourth and lesser known mode is kairos, or moment. In other words, what context or what are the circumstances that you're making your argument into? So that's Aristotle's formula. Logos, pathos, ethos, kairos. Logic, emotion, credibility, moment. Cicero, on the other hand, gives us 5 canons for rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Invention is about discovering what to say. You research, you build ideas, you consider how to present them. It's just what it sounds like. You're building something that works, in this case, an argument. Arrangement is about organizing your ideas into a flow to maximize the impact. Style is about word choice, sentence structure, rhetorical devices such as metaphors or parallelism. It's not just about what you say, but how you say it. Memory is where you master the material, you memorize it. And delivery is about your tone of voice, your hand gestures, your facial expressions, and so on. So it's about how you present your ideas, not just linguistically, but in every way. So these formulas for rhetoric by Aristotle and Cicero are elegant and they work. They have always worked. And the Elizabethan grammar school student was trained not just to know these approaches to rhetoric, but to use them. They were trained to develop strong, logically sound arguments, to package those arguments in language that really punched the point home. They had to practice and deliver their arguments from memory. So notice, this is not just Shakespeare, but also his audience. Your run-of-the-mill Elizabethan grammar school graduate was a more sophisticated poet, linguist, philosopher, and debater than your average PhD today, or lawyer. This helps explain why Shakespeare could write such sophisticated stories for an everyday audience. His everyday Elizabethan audience was highly sophisticated, and Shakespeare was sophisticated enough to stand head and shoulders over even that audience and captivate them. Of course, we don't live in such sophisticated times. In fact, we live in just about the polar opposite. Just a few years ago, Jonathan Haidt wrote an excellent article for The Atlantic titled, "Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid." And the culprit, by the way, is social media. Late last year, a series of articles came out about elite college students who can't read books. They view it as some sort of specialized skill. Plenty has been written on this. Attention spans have never been shorter. Most people would rather read a few thousand half-baked tweets than read the same number of words in a book with a complex and well-developed thesis. Even so, even today, Shakespeare can teach us something. His stories are timeless because he was trained to use the timeless tools for developing and delivering great ideas. One of those tools is kairos, moment, tailoring your message to the audience right in front of you. So we can bemoan the fact that the average modern audience spends all its time splashing in the shallows like infants rather than swimming in the deep like adults, or we can observe the audience in front of us, empathize with them, take an interest in them, and tailor our work to them. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and condense the overarching lesson that we can learn from Shakespeare into a brief axiom. Brevity is the soul of wit, after all. Shakespeare said that. So at the broadest level, Shakespeare teaches us that impactful stories use impactful language to convey impactful ideas. To borrow a term from Nietzsche, Shakespeare is the quintessential music-making Socrates. Great ideas conveyed with artistic flair. I asked you earlier why 400 years later we still remember the words "to be or not to be." These words come from one of Hamlet's most brilliant soliloquies, where he's asking himself whether it's better to live or die, and although his life is miserable and, in his view, hardly worth living, he's afraid of what might be waiting for him, as it were, on the other side, and he's not ready to take that bet. In other words, Hamlet reasoned through Pascal's wager, the idea that we have to bet our finite lives on infinite possibilities after death. Only Pascal hadn't written it yet. Shakespeare got there first. Pascal's wager is one of the most influential ideas in the entire history of philosophy. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, "The wager arguably has greater influence nowadays than any other such argument, not just in the service of Christian apologetics, but also in its impact on various lines of thought associated with infinity, decision theory, probability, epistemology, psychology, and even moral philosophy." And yet it could just as easily have been called Hamlet's wager. In fact, Hamlet did something especially clever and twisted with the wager, because he refused to kill his uncle when he first had the chance, because he didn't want to risk sending him to heaven. And so he waited until he could catch him doing something sinful and kill him then. That's quite a twist on Pascal's wager. So why do we still remember the words "to be or not to be" 400 years later? Because Shakespeare, our music-making Socrates, combined all the logical rigor of great thinking with all the poetic flair of great rhetoric, and that made his words unforgettable. His characters don't just have relatable struggles and experiences, they have big ideas and they champion them with great eloquence, and in doing so, they give us timeless words for our own struggles and experiences. In true Elizabethan fashion, he drops his characters into the arena of a story and lets them duke it out, one powerful idea at a time. Now, you might hear all this and think, great, so the lesson is to be philosophically, poetically, and rhetorically brilliant. Super helpful. Well, first of all, Shakespeare himself couldn't give you the blueprint to becoming Shakespeare. There can be only one. But the tried and true methods that Shakespeare learned in grammar school are more available to us than they've ever been. We can get our hands on any classic that we want for free. No Elizabethan library contained even a fraction of the literature that you have in your pocket. So we can learn, and we can recount what we learned to our friends and family to practice our delivery, and honestly just to have interesting, high-quality conversations about things that matter. We can get out there and challenge other people's ideas. We can invite them to challenge our ideas and see if we can defend them. We can wrestle deeply with our own life experience, ask big, hard questions, journal our reflections. Ironically, this cultural moment, with all of its poverty of attention, coincides with having the greatest wealth of knowledge available to the average person that the world has ever seen. So no, I can't give you how to write like Shakespeare in 3 easy steps, and anyone who claims they can is lying or delusional. But the lesson stands. Impactful stories use impactful language to convey impactful ideas. And there are absolutely ways to train and bolster the impact of our language and our ideas. Now, with that in mind, we spent some time on impactful ideas, but we haven't talked about impactful language. And one reason Shakespeare is so much fun to read is because of his mastery of the English language. Turn to any page of any Shakespeare story and you'll find some witty comeback, some brilliant metaphor, some wildly clever wordplay. It's uncanny, and frankly, you're more likely to leap over the Eiffel Tower than you are to match the towering brilliance of Shakespeare's language. He's in a league of his own. That's why it's so useful to read him, because just reading at that level can raise us to greater heights. That said, there are numerous poetic devices that he employs, and it can be helpful to simply catalog them just to be aware that these are linguistic tactics that are available to us. So metaphor and simile, for instance, are 2 well-known devices where you highlight an idea by comparison. One of his best-known metaphors is all the world's a stage. Or for one of his similes, Macbeth is described as running into battle, quote, like a roaring lion. There's also synecdoche, which is a figure of speech where a part represents the whole, or vice versa, where a whole represents the part. So Antony in Julius Caesar doesn't just say, listen to me. He says, lend me your ears. So the ears, in that case the part, are used to represent the whole person. Or the other way around in King Henry VI, Part 3, where one character says, England shall give me thanks for this. He's using the whole, England, to represent the part, those who would be grateful to him. There's prosopopoeia, which is kind of a cousin of anthropomorphism, where the poet gives voice or body or agency to something that's not human. So one character in Macbeth, for instance, doesn't just say it's dark outside. He says, dark night strangles the traveling lamp. That's classic prosopopoeia, giving the night agency to strangle something and giving the lamp the human-like quality of being strangled. There's antonomasia, where instead of calling someone by name, you call them by some descriptive phrase. Instead of calling Shakespeare Shakespeare, you might call him the Bard. But antonomasia can be elevating or derogatory. The Bard elevates Shakespeare. It's as if to say he's the storyteller above all storytellers. Othello, on the other hand, is derogatorily called the Moor throughout his play. That's antonomasia that demeans him by refusing to see him as anything but his race. There's antithesis, where you put contrasting ideas side by side, to be or not to be, or for a non-Shakespeare example, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. There's isocolon, where you string together a series of clauses that all have a similar length and structure, and it gives the sentence a kind of punchy flow. So for instance, one character in Richard II says, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. You can feel each clause kind of thrusting the sentence forward. There's epistrophe, where you string together clauses that have the same ending. So Shylock, for instance, in The Merchant of Venice says, I'll have my bond. Speak not against my bond. I have sworn an oath that I will have my bond. By repetition, it's much more intense. It carries a lot more emotion than if he'd said it just once. There's polysyndeton, where you string together a bunch of conjunctions, even though by the rules of grammar, you only need one. So for example, Othello says, if there be cords or knives, poison or fire or suffocating streams, I'll not endure it. He only needed one or, but putting more of them in there gave the sentence a nice flow and pathos. Or you can do the opposite, asyndeton, where you cut out all the conjunctions. In Julius Caesar, when Mark Antony is mourning over Caesar's body, he says, are all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, spoils, shrunk to this little measure? Technically, and should be in there. It should be conquests, glories, triumphs, and spoils. But like all great artists, Shakespeare knows precisely when to break the rules. No one breaks the rules better than Shakespeare. And I should be clear here, this would be a good reason to know the rules by heart, so that when you break them, it's not from ignorance. It's obvious when you break the rules by accident versus when you do it for artistic or rhetorical reason. One looks sloppy, one looks artful. Don't break the rules until you know how to follow them. So we've just briefly surveyed 10 poetic devices. There are others. If you want an exquisitely detailed breakdown of Shakespeare's use of poetic devices, I'll point you once again to Sister Miriam Joseph's book, Shakespeare's Use of the Arts of Language. I would advise any attorney, novelist, or any other storyteller to read and reread this book. But let's shift gears and ask a question. Shakespeare has taught us the value of rigorous thinking and the value of mastering all the tools that our language has to offer. So my question is, how do these features of Shakespeare's greatness fit into the mainstream advice that you'll get from modern storytelling coaches? Well, modern storytellers are told to focus on four main things for a standard story: plot, setting, characters, and style, especially character. They'll tell you, give your character some deep desire, have them strive for it, make the stakes of not getting it serious and personal, and that character will captivate the audience because the audience will root for or against them. So there are all sorts of tools out there for making your characters unique and making their desires obvious and deeply felt. And Shakespeare did just fine at this, but he didn't give us much in this area that you won't get from your average modern storytelling coach, which is why I'm not emphasizing characterization here. If you want to know my thoughts on characterization, I've made a video on it. Similarly, Shakespeare's plotting works just fine. He mostly just borrows from histories or from other stories, so nothing too wildly creative there. And as with characterization, there are all sorts of formulas circulating nowadays for organizing your plot just right, making sure you hit all the right beats at just the right time. And these tools are useful and worth knowing, the more the merrier, but where does, say, the use of great language fit into the modern storytelling advice? Well, it doesn't have to at all. Style is included in the modern advice, but on style, storytellers are told to follow the rules, certainly, which Grammarly or AI can pretty much do for you. And then we're told that we have a choice. We can use what's called invisible prose, meaning the language is simple and direct enough that the audience doesn't even notice it and can simply experience the story. Or we can use what's called purple prose, which is flowery and artistic, but careful, not everybody likes that. So if we want to learn how to write this so-called purple prose effectively, we're on our own. Just a few days ago, Hillary Lane posted a video on her YouTube channel, and the thumbnail caption was, "Modern writers can't write." And in the video, she observed something that I've noticed as well, which is that modern writing tends to sound bland and generic and doesn't have much of a flow to it. And she blamed this on the modern education system and AI, and I don't doubt that, but modern storytelling coaches aren't helping when they make it optional whether to master the language that we're writing in. Now, at this point, you may think, well, my audience isn't as sophisticated as Shakespeare's audience, so what's the point of mastering prose? My audience wouldn't understand it anyway. And yes, as we've already discussed, attention spans are shorter than ever, but that is not a reason to neglect the art of language. If anything, we need it more, because how else are we going to arrest the attention of the distracted public? The art of language is the art of getting your point across with maximum impact. It is an ancient, timeless art that has always worked in every culture. And part of the art is tailoring your language to the audience in front of you. Modern storytelling coaches would have us blunt our sharpest weapon or discard it altogether, and then we wonder why so many modern stories are so dull. So decide for yourself whether mastering the art of language is worthwhile. Just be aware that Shakespeare's linguistic prowess is not simply an embellishment on his greatness. His linguistic prowess is a key feature of his greatness. If Shakespeare had written in invisible prose, we wouldn't be talking about him right now. Let's keep going. We're asking how the core features of Shakespeare's greatness fit into the modern storytelling advice. And we've just talked about his mastery of the English language, but what about his intellectual rigor, his depth of thinking, his powerful rhetoric? Where does that fit in? Well, let's run back through the four pillars of modern storytelling: plot, setting, character, style. Where does depth and high quality critical thinking fit into this modern model? Yet again, it's optional. If anything, you'd be encouraged to deepen your characters, but not philosophically, emotionally. We're told to maximize the reader's emotional experience by putting our characters through relatable emotional events. As for philosophical depth, on the other hand, we are allowed to have philosophically deep characters and even a philosophical debate, as long as we don't spend too much time on it. And certainly don't get didactic about it. You're allowed to have big thoughts, but do not put them front and center. We wouldn't want the reader to suspect that you're trying to teach them anything. That's the prevailing modern view. Evidently, these moderns haven't read Dickens or Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Hugo or pretty much any enduring classic. So imagine my confusion when I first began studying storytelling and read all the modern books on the subject and learned that all my favorite writers were breaking the modern rules. C.S. Lewis, for instance, enthralled me in college. The Space Trilogy, Till We Have Faces, The Great Divorce. But by the four pillars of modern storytelling, Lewis is nothing special. His style is exquisite, his settings are beautiful, but on plotting and characterization, he's just so-so, at least by modern standards, but then it was his philosophical depth that drew me to him. And I didn't notice his supposed shortcomings, by the way, until modern storytelling coaches told me to look for them. And then I'm thinking, wow, Lewis missed these key aspects of storytelling. There's something about writing that my favorite writer didn't understand. And for a while, I accepted it as a fact, strange but true, that the writing world had evolved and left Lewis and others like him behind. Until I began to notice how many modern stories are bland and lifeless, forgettable, and yet, by the modern storytelling advice, flawless. Flawless and forgettable. Just these pristine little cookie cutter stories, as similar to each other as the cookie cutter houses that are churned out by the dozens nowadays. All perfect, all the same, none with an ounce of personality. Timeless, unforgettable stories, on the other hand, are strange and wild. They blow through your mind like a storm and shake you up. No cookie cutter model could contain the wildness of a great story without falling to pieces. That's why I've read and forgotten so many modern stories, but I will never forget Goethe's Faust because it so vigorously defied my worldview. I will never forget Paradise Lost because it so vigorously bolstered and expanded my worldview. And Shakespeare is unforgettable in doing the most extraordinary thing. He steps into the mindsets of multiple beliefs and experiences and speaks for them as eloquently as any of their best writers. There's no reason, for instance, to think that Shakespeare was a nihilist, but Macbeth's Tomorrow and Tomorrow speech portrays nihilism better than any nihilist you will ever read. There's no evidence that Shakespeare ever went to war, but King Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," beautifully captures faith, courage, and brotherhood before a battle. And it's where the World War II miniseries Band of Brothers got its name. Over and over again, Shakespeare does this, gives rhetorically powerful voice to a variety of beliefs and experiences. So again, decide for yourself whether it's worthwhile to wrestle with big ideas, to step into other people's shoes and consider in earnest how they think, to take jabs at your own worldview and see if it can hold water. I'm not really here to tell you what's worthwhile. I'm only here to tell you what Shakespeare did that makes him so unforgettable. The fact is, it's not economically or perhaps even socially safe to write a Shakespearean story, but it never has been. History's great storytellers can often be found fleeing their home country or being exiled or executed or being completely ignored until generations later. So if we're asking what's safe, it's much safer to whip out that cookie cutter and craft your story by the modern rules. The market is more likely to reward you for that, and you're much less likely to face any heat for it. But Shakespeare doesn't show us how to be safe. He shows us that impactful stories use impactful language to convey impactful ideas. And if that's your goal, as it is mine, then I hope this has been helpful, and may God bless you as you work to craft the stories that really make a difference. I'll see you next time.